Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm very happy to be joined by Diego Ellis Soto, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, and a research scientist at the California Academy of Sciences. He's an ecologist who works at the intersection of technology, conservation, policy, and environmental justice. And there's even some music in the mix, as you will soon hear. And while that may sound like a lot, you can trust me, it all comes together wonderfully. Let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so we're going to be chatting about a lot of topics today, but I thought an interesting place to get started might be about biodiversity data and its relationship with socioeconomic history and, things like redlining. And I was just hoping you'd give us a little bit of an overview and kind of introduce us to that topic.
Sure, I'm happy to. As a biodiversity scientist, I often look at a map filled with colors, which is often representative of the amount of information that we have about the things that crawl, fly, swim, and walk. However, each point of these data points represents a human going somewhere most of the time and recording a piece of information, or alternatively, deploying a sensor at a particular location. And it is well recognized and increasingly among ecologists that this biodiversity information also have a digital human fingerprint about the human histories of who collected this information, when, where, and this might even help us understand why. So a lot of my work currently is looking at these human histories embedded into our digital biodiversity systems, the infrastructures that we use to make decisions and inferences about how biodiversity will respond to climate change, up to human activities. So recognizing that there's a big human in the room when it comes to biodiversity data.
And do we see that in the form of something like perhaps birders being less likely to, practice their art on a busy city street where there might be birds versus, say, a public park, with nice trees and amenities? What kind of factors are at play there?
Yeah, and I find something very interesting when looking at a map on a global scale. We often see that places like the United States and Europe are fully bright with information of biodiversity, which would let us first guess perhaps that there's really great understanding everywhere in these countries about where biodiversity is. In parallel, many countries in the global south or near the tropics, which are some of the most biodiverse countries on Earth, have very limited amounts of biodiversity information, even though they are some of the most species-rich countries on Earth. But however, this also applies to countries, say, like the United States, because once we start zooming into these maps full of these bright colors, we also start seeing substantial gaps across the states, across cities, and even within cities. And these biodiversity data gaps, or cold spots of information, as I like to call them, are often the result of legacies of human histories, differences in socioeconomics, and legacies of segregation, such as the example of redlining that we can talk about.
Okay, and so how does redlining play into the data that we have, and then maybe even the types of conservation actions that we might take?
Yes. So here, however, I need to start perhaps by starting that I am not someone from this country. I am a Uruguayan Italian that has not been affected by any of these segregationary practices. So it's always a bit challenging to talk about it from this point. But redlining was a top-down practice that prevented and segregated particularly African Americans from 1933 onwards up to patterns that persist in zonings in cities upon this day. It's important to say that this was not the first and definitely not the last segregationist practice that happened in these countries that split communities and preventing some communities of accumulating generational wealth. In 1929, after the Great Depression, the Federal Housing Association started a loan program to support Americans at risk of home closures. However, one of the primary arguments on whether a loan should be given and deemed a good investment or a hazardous investment was to look at the makeup of the population of particular neighborhoods in cities. So across almost 200 cities in the United States, these maps were drawn in different neighborhoods, considering whether a neighborhood should receive financial investments that are good or hazardous. And it is important to state that while 10% of the United States population approximately were African Americans during that time, only 1.8% approximately of all of these loans went to African Americans. And another point that is really important to consider is that one of the primary arguments for which the Federal Housing Association deemed that an investment and giving loans was risky was based on the makeup of people living in these neighborhoods. And neighborhoods with a lot of African Americans or immigrant communities were deemed really risky investments and were not given such loans when compared to other neighborhoods. A lot of public health studies from the 2000s and the last couple of years are showing that these differences that have segregated cities nowadays, we have found that some of these redline areas are hotter. They have lower tree canopy cover. There's lower home ownership. There's higher rates of cancer. And if we think that these human legacies and histories of segregation have shaped the zoning of our cities, which further has affected the trees and the environmental amenities across these urban environments, some of my work, inspired by seminal papers, for example, of Chris Schell in 2020 in Science, asked what are the consequences of these legacies of segregation on biodiversity, and what are the consequences on biodiversity data? Because it's very important to understand, for example, where birds are, because I would argue that one of the first building blocks of conservation decisions is to know where are species and where are they not, in order to make targeted, more efficient conservation interventions, conservation investments, and educational opportunities in a more equitable way for all inhabitants of the United States.
So this is, in a sense, kind of what we're talking about when we talk about a topic like systemic racism. It really is, it does permeate through practically everything to the point where it's now affected the sort of, biodiversity data even that we have at hand.
Yeah, and I think this is extremely important to consider in the age of these large, complex models that feed into large amount of data that we use in order to make decisions, not just to understand where biodiversity is under climate change, but also where we decide to buy large amounts of land and move billions of dollars in conservation investments in order to protect biodiversity, but also make sure that there's a more even distribution of nature benefits and contributions to people. If we think about all the benefits that it has to be around nature. And it's very important to consider this human dimension shaping our information on biodiversity at the very beginning of the decision making, as opposed to at the very end.
So let's talk a little bit about that distribution of conservation funding, and maybe throw out a hypothetical example or something. What are kind of the implications of that in terms of not having the data from a particular area, not recognizing its biodiversity importance, and then failing to invest? How could that kind of play out in a sort of practical sense?
Yeah, I'm going to hypothesize a little bit here,
Sure.
but I believe that this is similar to the snake biting its own tail. This often leads me to believe that maybe certain areas that were critical habitat for some species, but did not have information digitized to advocate for this place to not be changed or altered. How often did these places miss out of ecological restoration or restoring of green spaces or monitoring of invasive species that cost billions of dollars to the US economy, up to monitoring zoonotic vectors such as information of mosquitoes? We know that there is lower amount of information of mosquitoes in lower income communities than higher income community in the United States, and that is a potential health hazard. Some of my recent work is showing that there's very few mosquito records in the state of Texas below the poverty line, and one could argue that these communities are the most vulnerable to such zoonotic outbreaks because they also have lower access to healthcare opportunities.
Yeah, and in particular, living in a country that doesn't have the most equitable distribution of healthcare resources, to put it mildly, this would be a case in which people are potentially exposed to a greater number of zoonoses, and at the same time, they're less able to get care if they encounter one.
Yeah, and when it comes to conservation, I often think that in these very large data-hungry complex models, they do a really good job at predicting large patterns of biodiversity across a landscape under different scenarios. But I think is very important for us as scientists to communicate what goes in at the beginning of the model and what does not, because that is very important information for a practitioner to have at hand to understand the limitation of this model. For example, if I were to download these data sets that are at the global scale from a database such as GBIF called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is almost like a black hole of open available global information, if I were to use that blindly without considering these digital human fingerprints in the biodiversity data, I might be omitting from the very beginning of my model low-income communities. And it might be really hard for these models to understand that actually several bird species might be living in these areas that require conservation efforts, that can benefit conservation investments in local communities and educational investments in K-12 STEM opportunities. But our models are not highlighting these. So we are at risk at losing the people that are most in need of these resources and that have been marginalized for the longest times because of some of our conservation actions.
And, what is there a sort of generalizable explanation for why data has historically not been collected in socioeconomically challenged areas? Is there a single explanation, or is it, many little things? What kind of leads us to not have bird abundance data in, one redlined area and not have mosquito data in areas of Texas below the poverty line? Is there a single set of, explanations that kind of give us some insight into why that might occur?
I think it's a large combination, and perhaps I would start by highlighting that I am not a sociologist nor a historian. I am a quantitative biologist with a very limited experience in understanding the human histories of the country that I'm a non-resident alien in currently. However, I do recognize that um, observing the natural world is often a luxury where you need to have a lot of free time. You need to have a lot of access to technology and information. And that if we look at the socio-demographic of who's collecting such information, we often see very strong patterns that people who might be prone to go bird watching might be in their mid 50s or in an older demographic and might primarily identify to a certain demographic. So second, um, there's there's a strong bias in where we are pooling environmental resources for education, and that's something that I'm actively trying to do here in the Bay Area, and I have done in New Haven, and I'm happy to revisit at the very end, which is a little solution, which is how can we engage local communities from the very beginning as opposed to parachute science on these neighborhoods, go out, collect some data sets, and then leave. That's not going to help on the long term at all. What we need to do is empower local communities, provide the financial resources, and pay them for their services, engage with local high school teachers, engage with grassroots organizations, and try to create long-term stable funding sources through biodiversity indicators that account for these socioeconomic gaps, biodiversity indicators that account for human histories shaping biodiversity information. And these gaps, I would say it's not a problem that only occurs in the United States. This will also happen across many different countries where socioeconomic gradients or certain key areas will have much more information about the natural world than others. This can be in the form of research stations in remote areas in South America have much more information than deep into the national park. That does not mean that there's not biodiversity there. Similarly, wealthier areas across the world also show substantial more data than lower income countries. So this is more of a universal pattern that occurs across scales, at the global scale, up to single neighborhoods in our cities in the United States. And I also believe that while I am extremely excited about all of these technological advances that we're encountering, we're having a revolution in data science right now, including in biodiversity and conservation. Sometimes it's extremely important to consider human histories, politics, political ecology, and socioeconomic context for sustainable long-term positive change. And that is something that sociologists and historians have been saying for a long time. And perhaps myself included as an ecologist or a conservation biologist have not done the best job at giving them a place at the table. So I think that it's extremely important moving forward that we need to invite more people at the table, including computer scientists with their amazing new technologies, but also historians, social scientists, economists, local community members, and co-develop these things and not come with these often solutions that we believe are scalable. But as we all know, conservation and local systems, especially in urban environments, are such complex systems that are not just reigned by biological principles, but also by complex social, cultural, historic, and anthropogenic actions that are actually the dominant forces shaping cities.
So it's one of those cases in which you can't parachute in from an ivory tower and take a look at, an individual system and view it outside of its history, its politics, the socioeconomics of the area, and get any kind of realistic view of even what's going on sort of an ecological level.
Yeah, it's something that we discovered, for example, in our publication that looked at 195 cities in the United States, and it did something pretty simple, actually. We downloaded all the data that we have on birds in the United States in these 195 cities, and we basically asked, are there differences in how much information I have about birds in non-red line neighborhoods and red line neighborhoods? In 195 cities, which approximately was, I believe, 34 million Americans live now. And we discovered that on average, there's more than twice as much information about birds in non-red line areas than red line areas. We performed another model to show that these differences persist even after accounting for differences in green space, in climate, population density, anything birds might be also driven and shaped by. Another second striking result that we found was that these inequalities in where we're collecting data, even though this is a policy that started almost 100 years ago, these inequalities are actually growing and amplifying right now in the age of open digital information. And this highlights the importance of considering local context and co-developing and engaging and working with local communities um, from the very beginning and providing them with financial opportunities to be able to go have this luxury, so to say, of going out several times a day and collecting and documenting biodiversity, promoting more resources into environmental education. Because if we think about it, it's not just benefits that we have as biodiversity scientists or as city managers to better understand where are endangered species, where is the monarch butterfly, where are invasive species such as the spotted lanternfly that are causing billions of dollars, but also the long-term educational, mental health, and physical benefit of being outside in nature. I would argue that the encouragement of having youth going out to nature is a very, very popular and important principle across all states. We all acknowledge, probably, or I believe, that we live in a more noisy world with a lot of digital information, with a lot of phones. So it's a very good thing to re-engage with nature. And what better way sometimes than going out and going bird watching for a little bit? It relaxes your mind. Yeah, you learn more about the natural world. You can meet people. There's all these additional benefits. And even further, if we as scientists and policymakers engage more in places that have historically been underserved when it comes to promoting environmental education and financial investments, there's a lot of co-benefits that we can give. And we should have been, even as scientists, we need to be a little bit more paying attention on where we're going and where we're not.
That's fascinating. And this kind of brings to mind an example from my own local area. And so I'll throw it out there and then we can talk about the ways that you would ameliorate this kind of thing. So I live in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, and about 25 minutes from where I live in a very wealthy area, there is this nice nature preserve. And in it they have set up a little place where you can put your cell phone and take a picture, and it's used for kind of long-term monitoring. It gives a view of the landscape that can then be used by scientists. But I note that there is no similar little structure that exists anywhere in downtown Norfolk, which is closer to where I live and a less privileged area. And so I'm sort of wondering what kind of steps can be taken to ensure that these types of things are available to those in all communities. And, I'm also wondering about what your experience has been like in doing this kind of work.
Yeah, and I have started in local efforts, and it's also really important to mention that some of the birth movements of community science were an environmental justice movement where communities organized to fight environmental injustices. And so these bottom-up grassroots organizations were often in these underrepresented minorities and communities that we are not supporting enough nowadays, even though they have been fundamental for the environmental justice movement and for fighting for many of these strong policies that have improved the environmental health and probably indirectly saved thousands of people's lives. So my the way that I sometimes approach environmental education locally is to remind myself that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are anthropogenic cost crisis events. So the uneven distribution of resources is amplifying greenhouse gas emission and is driving species biodiversity loss. That means that socioeconomics and human behavior is one of the most important drivers to understand the implications of species loss and climate change in the Anthropocene. However, we are not giving them the place in the table that they deserve, in my personal opinion, in some of these larger global conservation arenas with the advent of technology. What I also find remarkable is that as biodiversity scientists, we have really, really cool technology that is becoming accessible financially to promote environmental education. And I see immense opportunity in doing so, but not just in doing so, but also having fun on the way. For example, I'm here in my office surrounded by acoustic sensors that record birds um, from anything between $900 and $300 that can listen to a bird 24/7 and detect species. And I like to call these bird spy microphones when I work with local communities. Above my head, there's also an origami microscope that costs approximately $1 that allows a kid in 15 minutes to turn a piece of paper into a microscope and learn about cells, about any plants. How incredible are these tools? We need to start highlighting these really incredible stories about nature that are facilitated through advancement in technologies, not just to scientists with a PhD, but to an 8-year-old to change the world in the future. Because if I close my eyes sometimes and think, what made me study environmental sciences? It had nothing to do with a scientific fact or a scientific article. It had everything to do about how I felt being in nature. And I did not grow up in the remote wilderness all of the time. We went camping sometimes in Uruguay with my parents. I These experiences were very, very formative in my experience. And I think that in an increasingly noisy and distracting world, we need to promote these opportunities of feeling like you are in nature, feeling small, seeing a sunset, listening to birds, comparing the sounds of silence or of nature and then going back to a bigger city, getting this appreciation to all youth across the United States, because that is ultimately what creates stewards of your local environment, stewards of your local place. In some ways that we have been doing this was starting in New Haven, where I did my PhD, where we engaged with a group called Pathway to Science, where youth from New Haven, a lot of Spanish speakers, which for me is always very fun because I can give half of my talks in Spanish, half in English, and we can talk about stories about birds that cross their native country and cross across the United States and back and forth, creating these stories about human histories, culture, and nature. But what we have done is we have looked into some of these places we have very little biodiversity information, and we've talked about this with local communities and local youth and highlighting the importance of co-developing plans of perhaps engaging with a local high school on creating a long-term monitoring program of bird biodiversity in your space and highlighting that they can actually change the amount of information that we have collected in 100 years, facilitate with some of these technologies. And there's also all these benefits for youth of learning this. For example, I have here next to me something called a Raspberry Pi, which is another one of these bird spy microphones that uses artificial intelligence to recognize which bird is calling based on its song. I think this is one of the best ways of explaining AI and demystifying the black box that we are currently encountering in our technology. This is really cool because it also teaches kids not just about environmental stewardship, but learning how to birdwatch, but also about technology and how technology can be used for good. And if then that student decides to go to college or do an apprenticeship, they will also have all this K-12 STEM knowledge alongside in an activity. And at the very end, something that I've been very excited to do is take those recordings of birds and go into a music studio and make hip hop beats or bachata beats with youth and co-develop these songs. And that's something that I'm really excited to do in the future because it also creates place-based art and music. And again, if I think about the conservation crisis as a human socioeconomic, human behavior, psychology dimension, uh, it's really, really important to create stories, local stories and narratives that not just include scientists, but include educators, uh, local community members, city council, artists, environmental educators. Everyone needs to have a place in the table.
This is really cool. So this sounds like it's, a technology that has the potential to help address some of those data gaps, but at the same time, encourage connection with nature, allow young people to accrue some of those benefits that happen, psychologically and otherwise from being out in nature, wherever that might be. And while they're also at the same time learning and gaining greater knowledge of the the world around them and the technology that's used to facilitate this. This sounds like a whole lot of great things that are happening all at once, and of course, then creating some art with it, which we'll listen to in just a moment. But this really sounds like a lot of things coming together in a really interesting way.
Yeah, I think that these are data-driven, place-based stories that we are creating. So we are not just collecting information and filling important biodiversity data gaps that then help not just make us inform better models, hopefully create more equitable conservation outcomes, decisions, and investments, highlighting the need of where are species of conservation concern, where are species that are zoonotic vectors, where are invasive species, where are the monarch butterflies. We need to better understand this, also to create these large-scale corridors across our protected areas. But what I've also encountered, to be quite frankly, is that once a group of teenagers sees a drum machine and some beats, they become very excited and very interested and pay a lot of attention. And they leave feeling really proud because they've just combined the sound of an American rabbit with a beat and a snare. And that is something that they remember. And similar to someone who's a non-native English speaker, I often need to make these like tongue twisters and to connect words and not forget about them. Something similar might be happening with recognizing birds.
That's really cool. And I think now sounds like a good time to have a quick listen. Shall I cue up these Yale farm birds?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
All right, cool. So let's enjoy just a few minutes of some birds, beats, and other sounds from the farm. And we'll be back in just a few minutes to talk about what we listened to. Okay, that was really cool. Can you tell us a little bit about what we were hearing there?
Yeah. So these were sounds collected at the Yale Farm in New Haven, Connecticut, as a proof of concept, which ultimately inspired and uh, helped us incorporate some of these place-based musical creations into our educational programs with Pathway to Science. So what we did there was to install some of these bird spy microphones in March during bird migration on an urban farm as a proof of concept in the middle of the city of New Haven. What was really incredible is that with an investment of $300 approximately, we were able to detect over 60 species of birds that fly over this 1.5 acre urban farm in an urban environment. And that's 6% of all of birds in the United States in one
Wow.
month. That is pretty crazy. And we collected over 30,000 data points. And I think that this, at least in my personal journey of still trying to find, co-develop, and discover my own place in this creation of bringing the hidden lives of nature through technology and music and art into education, it really helped me understand a couple of things. First, that these incorporating some of these technologies with engaged hardworking local people is extremely validating and important. And second, it showed us that this proof of concept totally works. And since then, we've encountered an incredible appetite in this technology. I'm happy to mention, for example, that now that I live in California, Berkeley, this program is continuing in New Haven. In fact, there's a collaboration between Yale University and Music Haven where principles about nature music are being taught in a musical classroom now. Another aspect is that we are in conversations with primarily undergrad universities and HBCUs on creating an environmental justice curriculum for urban biodiversity. How can we better link urban agriculture with teachings of biodiversity? Some of the most incredible spaces in urban environments where people find access to nature, we can touch earth and deconnect, are these urban farms, for example. I found these to be an incredible relief during the COVID-19 pandemic for my own well-being, just weeding some grass. It's so incredibly relaxing. And birds think the same. There's a lot of bird biodiversity in these places that we're not documenting enough. So it's really important to provide environmental, but also financial resources to document biodiversity there and co-develop these with local community members. I also found that through the lens of music, it allows me almost to wear two hats, one as a scientist and one as a creator, environmental educator. And what's really interesting about this is that through this musical exploration, I've been engaged in conferences at the intersection of religion and ecology, things that I never thought I would do. I was able to talk about bird biodiversity and conservation and find extremely common ground with different churches across the United States in ways that I wouldn't have thought before. And we as scientists probably have not done the best way of engaging with these groups before. However, we all found immediately common ground that birds are incredibly beautiful to listen to, and that we're all curious about who or what lives around us. So I believe that um, these place-based communications and stories facilitated by technology and science are really appealing and also allows us to give this renewed importance about some of the hidden heroes of our local urban conservation, which are community gardens, little grassroots food justice organization, environmental educators in these underserved neighborhoods that do not have the same resources as other places. So I believe that as it's really important to consider long-term financial mechanisms from the conservation movement or for climate change mitigation assessment that help us fill these gaps in a way that is not parachute science and in a way that can also help us create art, music, which engages local community and ultimately increases resilience and coexistence with the natural world and is something that can be fun along the way.
That is so cool, and this certainly was fun, and I've really enjoyed both listening to the music and the birds and the landscape, and hearing about all these great programs. What's next for your work?
Oh gosh. What's next for me? Well, I'm trying to turn this concept into a nationwide curriculum that is open source and freely available of charge, and trying to make curriculums for high schoolers, for primary schoolers, up to the undergrad level on how can we incorporate technological advances in an environmental just way that is bottom up from the very beginning, as opposed to at the end when we have the solution. This involves creating curriculums about how to best use these bird spy microphones, trying to co-develop these with local NGOs at the beginning of a course or a local grassroots organizations, ask them what benefit they could have and listen to them carefully and treat them equally on the table at the very beginning. So in California, what that means for me, I'm currently trying to explore this across Oakland. I've engaged in maker spaces to see if can we build a bird spy microphone with these volunteers that like to solder things and know about these things actually way more than I do. Um, I am really actively trying to engage and into environmental programs that are actively ongoing because it's really important that these things exist without needing someone like me. So I see a very limited role of my own in being the important person keeping the fort together, but rather engage and co-develop place-based flavors of this scientific communication with environmental groups. For example, the first hour, going on a little walk and looking at, hey, what is this bird? What is this bird? The next step, looking on a map, whether why is there not information on that bird here, but in other neighborhoods there is? Isn't that interesting? Third, talking about the ramifications of this, that these places might be forgotten when it comes to conservation decisions or substantial investments or future environmental educational opportunities and associated benefits of nature to people. And then fourth, let's collect some of this data. Let's understand how technology such as AI is helping us mapping that on the world. And number five, bringing that to a music studio such as the one I can show you in a little bit that we have here at UC Berkeley and making place-based compositions. And number six, summarize and digest what we've just thought about and ask kids what their favorite experience of the day was. And this can be adapted to different levels of budgets, anything from let's forget about the Birds by microphone, we're just using cell phones and an app to make a beat that costs nothing, up to let's build a Raspberry Pi at the undergraduate level, install an AI on it so that we learn how to do these skills and then we can apply to anything else we want, which is a really great professional skill in nowadays. Also, what is next? I almost forgot to mention a few things I'm extremely interested and excited about. We are trying to incorporate these socioeconomic considerations in the next City Nature Challenge of San Francisco, which is an event where for several days, people all over the city are collecting information on biodiversity in their free time with applications such as iNaturalist. And we're trying to create practices that help both identify where biodiversity gaps are really important to be filled, but we're also highlighting social and economic context to be more mindful on where we should look and where we should perhaps engage from the very beginning with local community members for a more equitable collection of biodiversity data. I'm very excited about this because over 600 cities across the world participate in this event, being the largest event of participatory biodiversity science in the world. So if we can start locally in the city, have so much scalability potential for a more equitable bottom-up collection of biodiversity data. And I'm also very happy to mention that I'm in early conversations with different parts of the UC reserve system and different local organizations in San Francisco to create days where we look for biodiversity with a group of visitors. And then we also make a day of nature music where anyone that has a guitar, a piano can just show up and we can just jam in community with all the bird sounds and nature sounds we collected that day and almost make a symphony together of human nature that is place-based.
That sounds like such a good time. I hope that after you've got it recorded, you'll be able to come back and we can have a listen to it on the show.
Oh, another fun thing that I never expected to happen is last year I put a song out called "Who Knew Termites Can Jam?" That was basically a song made by termites and computer vision, and it caught the attention of electronic music producers. And I was invited twice now, or three times. I don't know if I can go yet this year, but to an electronic music festival called Slingshot in Durham, North Carolina, and we were able to perform trees making photosynthesis, birds on a farm, to a electronic music festival with really substantial musicians. So that is something I never even dreamed of. And I was able to talk about bird biodiversity and data visualization with musical artists across the world. And I'll give you just one example about this open-ended exploration, because I think we can turn this into a global movement of scientists meeting with environmentalists and artists and musicians. Um, there is a group called 89 Birds from Colombia that I was able to talk to him backstage that is making songs about birds in Colombia, which is the country with the most birds on Earth. So an extremely important, diverse country. And we were able to talk about biodiversity, and I was able to show them some of these maps that are often only in scientific publications. And they further asked me for some custom visualizations for their own musical festivals now that are data-driven stories of animal migrations. So there's so much potential and overlap that we can have as scientists in engaging with all of these various facets of society that are really important to creating long-term coexistence and resilience and sustainability.
Oh, that is so cool. And, I will definitely include a link in the show notes to the termites jamming. I enjoyed that one as well.
Yeah.
This has been so fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.